The history books often tell us that Stalingrad was won by the sheer numbers of the Red Army, a human wave that overwhelmed German skill. But that's a narrative designed to soothe the egos of the defeated. The truth is far more unsettling. It was a victory of superior intelligence, industrial miracles, and a lethal arrogance that blinded the German high command to the reality right in front of their eyes. Hitler didn't just lose an army on the Volga, he lost the war because he chose a myth over the math. Today, we examine the unheeded warnings and the concrete jungle to see how 300,000 men were abandoned by a leader who valued his own pride more than their lives. If you think you know the story of Stalingrad, you might find that the most important lessons were the ones left in the snow. Many of us remember the history books of our youth, which often painted the Second World War as a series of inevitable maps and arrows. But if we sit down and really look at the winter of 1942, we find something far more chilling than a simple military maneuver. It was a collision between a lethal delusion and a cold, hard reality that most in the West, and certainly in Berlin, never saw coming. You see, by the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler wasn't just a dictator, he was a man convinced of his own divinity. He looked at the vast expanse of the Soviet Union and didn't see a nation, he saw a rotten structure that only required one good kick to collapse. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a formal state ideology. The German high command had categorized the Soviet people as undermenschen, subhumans. They genuinely believed that a Slavic soldier, by virtue of his inferior blood, simply lacked the spirit, the intelligence, and the will to stand against the master race. But history suggests that when you underestimate a man's home, his family, and his very right to exist, you invite a ferocity that no racial theory can account for. While Hitler was dismissively waving away reports of Soviet tank production, the subhumans were busy performing an industrial miracle behind the Ural Mountains. The Germans had done their math based on the 200 Soviet divisions they encountered in 1941. But by 1942, General Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, was writing in his diary with a sense of mounting dread. He noted that for every dozen Soviet divisions the Wehrmacht smashed, the Russians simply put up another dozen. The subhuman resurgence was not a myth, it was a flood of T-34 tanks and millions of men who had decided that if they were to die, they would take the master race into the grave with them. This brings us to the specific delusion that sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. Hitler's dismissal of the Red Army was so absolute that he began to treat the Eastern Front like a foregone conclusion. He famously remarked, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." It's the kind of overconfidence we've all seen in life, the man who thinks the game is won before the fourth quarter even starts. In Hitler's mind, the Soviet Union was already a ghost. Therefore, he made the fatal decision to split his forces, sending the 4th Panzer Army south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and leaving General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army to seize Stalingrad. He wasn't just seeking a strategic victory, he was seeking a symbolic one, the destruction of the city that bore his rival's name. What he failed to realize was that the Red Army he was dismissing had spent the last year learning, evolving, and hardening. The Soviet soldier, whom German propaganda described as primitive and incapable of complex thought, was about to introduce the Wehrmacht to a new kind of hell. As the Sixth Army approached the banks of the Volga, they weren't marching toward a victory parade. They were marching into a trap set by an enemy they refused to believe was their equal. The stage was set for a reality check that would cost 300,000 German lives and break the back of the Third Reich. But before the first shot was fired in the ruins of the city, the defeat had already happened. Not on the battlefield, but in the mind of a leader who believed his own myths. There is a specific kind of silence you find in the Great Plains of the American Midwest, where the horizon seems to pull away from you the faster you drive toward it. For the German soldier in the summer of 1942, the Russian steppe felt much the same, only infinitely more predatory. To the planners in Berlin, the map looked like an invitation, a vast, flat tabletop perfect for the high-speed maneuvers of the Blitzkrieg. History suggests, however, that space itself can be a weapon if you don't have the stomach or the fuel to conquer it. Hitler looked at the map of southern Russia and saw a vacuum. He saw a landscape that lacked the natural barriers of the West, believing his panzer divisions could simply roll until they hit the oil-rich Caspian Sea. Therefore, the German High Command launched Operation Blue with confidence that bordered on the suicidal. They were operating on a logistical strip string, fueled by the assumption that the Soviet resistance would remain as fragmented as it had been the year prior. But as any man who has ever worked with heavy machinery knows, distance is a tax that must be paid in oil, rubber, and blood. The further the Sixth Army pushed into that endless green sea, the more their umbilical cord of supplies began to fray. It looked like solid ground, but it was a logistical nightmare. The Soviet rail gauge was different from the European standard, meaning every ton of ammunition, every liter of fuel, and every loaf of bread had to be offloaded at the border and reloaded onto captured or converted trains. When those ran out, the Germans relied on trucks, but the Russian roads were often little more than dirt tracks that turned into impassable soup at the first sign of rain. This overextension was a mechanical breakdown of historic proportions. By the time the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, they weren't the shiny motorized juggernaut that had paraded through Paris. They were a horse-drawn army. It's a fact often lost in the movies, but nearly 80% of the German army's transport relied on animal power. Imagine, if you will, trying to maintain a modern front line across 1,000 miles of wilderness using hay and oats as your primary fuel. As the distance from the supply railheads grew to over 200 miles, the Sixth Army began to starve before the first winter frost even arrived. The tanks that were supposed to be the tip of the spear were often found sitting idle, not because they were broken, but because the fuel trucks were stuck in the mud or had been picked off by Soviet partisans. The partisan threat was the untold the Soviets reaped from the Germans' arrogance. Because Hitler viewed the local populations as subhumans, the German occupation was unnecessarily brutal. Therefore, every forest and every ravine behind the German lines became a hiding place for saboteurs. These weren't just soldiers, they were grandfathers and farmhands who spent their nights blowing up bridges and cutting telephone wires. The German soldier began to feel a psychological weight that many veterans of the era described as the steppe sickness. It was the realization that no matter how many miles you marched, there was always more Russia. The horizon never changed. The villages were burned-out husks. The wells were often poisoned. You were winning battles, yes, but you were losing the war against geography. Hitler, sitting in his command bunker thousands of miles away, dismissed these logistical concerns as defeatism. He believed that the will of the Aryan soldier could overcome the need for winter coats or spare parts. He saw the steppe as a minor obstacle to be crossed. But the steppe was actually a giant sponge, soaking up German manpower and equipment until there was nothing left but a thin, brittle shell. This brittle shell was now approaching the Volga River. The Germans believed that once they reached the water's edge, the illusion would end and victory would be theirs. What they didn't realize was that the endless steppe had merely been the preamble. The true horror was waiting for them in the ruins of a city that refused to die. When we think of the Second World War, we often picture the wide-open tank battles of North Africa or the hedgerows of Normandy. But Stalingrad was something else entirely. It was the moment the German Blitzkrieg, that lightning war of movement and grace, hit a brick wall and shattered. History suggests that a city is not just a collection of buildings. In the hands of a desperate defender, it becomes a vertical fortress where every window is a barrel and every basement is a grave. For General Friedrich Paulus and the men of the Sixth Army, the approach to the Volga River was supposed to be the final act of a triumphant campaign. They could see the silver ribbon of the river from the high ground, the city of Stalingrad stretching 20 miles along its bank. Therefore, the German command followed their standard doctrine. They sent the Luftwaffe to level the city. Thousands of tons of high explosives turned the Paris of the steppes into a jagged moonscape of scorched timber and twisted rebar. But here is where the German master race logic failed them. They believed that by destroying the buildings, they were destroying the defense. The reality was the exact opposite. By turning the city into a labyrinth of rubble, the Germans inadvertently created the perfect terrain for the Red Army. The German tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, found themselves trapped in narrow streets choked with debris. A panzer is a king on the open plains, but in a ruined city it is a blind giant. But the Soviet defenders, led by General Vasily Chuikov, developed a tactic they called hugging the enemy. They stayed so close to the German lines, often just a wall's thickness away, that the Germans couldn't call in their superior artillery or air support for fear of hitting their own men. This was the birth of what the German soldiers began to call Rattenkrieg, or rat war. It's a term that hits home for anyone who has ever had to crawl through a cramped attic or a dark crawl space. It was a war fought in 3 dimensions, in the sewers below the streets, on the factory floors, and in the rafters of the apartment blocks. We aren't talking about kilometers or miles anymore. We are talking about the Red October steelworks, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. These weren't just landmarks, they were meat grinders. In the grain silo, Soviet and German troops fought for weeks over individual floors. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary that they had captured the kitchen but were still fighting for the living room. This brings us to a psychological shift that many of us can empathize with, the loss of the big picture. To the soldier in the ruins, the war wasn't about the Caucasus oil or the fate of the Reich. It was about the sniper hiding in the rusted boiler 50 yards away. The Soviet snipers, like the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, became the ghosts of the concrete jungle. They didn't just kill men, they killed the German sense of superiority. Every time a German officer stepped out of a doorway, he was gambling with his life. The Germans were forced to pay a reward of thousands of lives for every city block they cleared, and clearing it didn't mean they owned it. The Soviets would use the sewer systems to crawl back into buildings the Germans had captured the day before. Imagine the mental toll, waking up in a building you bled for, only to find the enemy is back in the basement beneath your boots. Hitler, obsessed with the name of the city, refused to allow Paulus to bypass the ruins or surround them. He demanded the city be taken house by house. Therefore, the Sixth Army was sucked into a vortex. They were using up their best infantry, their elite pioneers, and their dwindling ammunition in a fight that neutralized all their technical advantages. The concrete jungle was a leveling of the playing field. In the ruins, a subhuman with a submachine gun was just as lethal as a Prussian aristocrat in a Tiger tank. The Germans were winning the city, block by bloody block, but they were losing the army. And while they were looking down into the basements of Stalingrad, they forgot to look behind them at the hundreds of miles of open flank that held their only line of retreat. In any major construction project or long-term investment, the most dangerous point isn't always the work right in front of you. It's the structural support you've neglected while focusing on the finish line. For the German High Command in the autumn of 1942, they were so obsessed with the finish line of the Volga riverbanks that they ignored the fact that their entire southern front was resting on a foundation of sand. History suggests that hubris doesn't just blind you to your enemy's strength, it blinds you to your own frailty. As the Sixth Army poured its elite divisions into the meat grinder of Stalingrad, the front lines began to stretch and thin until they resembled a rubber band pulled to the point of snapping. To cover these hundreds of miles of open, freezing steppe, Hitler didn't use German regulars. Instead, he assigned the task to his allies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, the Italians, and the Hungarians. Now, these were men who fought with bravery, but they were trapped in an impossible situation. They were equipped with captured weapons, lacked sufficient anti-tank guns, and perhaps most crucially, they knew they were being used as cannon fodder to protect a German victory they would never share. The warnings were not silent. In fact, they were deafening. General Dumitrescu of the Romanian Third Army sent frantic reports back to the German headquarters. He noted that the Soviet Union was building massive bridgeheads on the western bank of the Don River, the very side the Axis was supposed to control. He reported the sound of hundreds of tank engines idling in the distance under the cover of the night. But Hitler and his inner circle dismissed these reports as Latin nervousness. There's a specific kind of frustration we've all felt when a supervisor ignores a glaring problem because it doesn't fit their preferred narrative. Hitler believed the Soviets were spent forces. He was convinced that the Red Army was throwing its last reserves into the city ruins. Therefore, he concluded that any Soviet buildup on the flanks was a bluff or a desperate, disorganized gathering of stragglers. However, the Soviets mastered a masterclass in deception known as maskirovka. While the Germans were counting the few Soviet battalions left in the city ruins, the Red Army was secretly moving over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft to the flanks. They moved only at night. They maintained total radio silence. They built fake bridges to draw German fire, while submerged stealth bridges sat just inches below the water surface, invisible to German reconnaissance. As the winter of 1942 began to bite, the reward for this Soviet patience was almost ready for harvest. The German soldiers in the city started to notice a strange change in the weather, not just the cold, but a chilling lack of Soviet artillery fire. It was the silence before a dam breaks. On the morning of November 19th, a thick fog rolled across the steppe. The Romanian soldiers in their shallow trenches could hear a low rumble that felt like an earthquake. This wasn't a bluff. This was Operation Uranus. The Soviet artillery barrage was so intense that it was reportedly heard hundreds of miles away. When the fog lifted, the Romanians saw thousands of T-34 tanks charging across the snow. These men had no Panzerfausts to stop them. They had light anti-tank guns that the Soviet armor simply brushed aside like toys. Within hours, the Romanian lines didn't just bend, they evaporated. The but in this narrative is perhaps the most tragic moment for the common German soldier. General Paulus, seeing the disaster unfolding behind him, asked for permission to withdraw from the city to meet the threat. He knew that if he didn't move, the Sixth Army would be cut off, but Hitler's response was a categorical no. He ordered the Sixth Army to stay exactly where they were, claiming that where the German soldier sets foot, there he remains. It was a decision based on prestige, not perish. Hitler could not stomach the idea of retreating from the city that bore Stalin's name, even if staying meant the certain destruction of his finest army. The consequence was swift. The two Soviet pincers, one from the north and one from the south, raced toward each other across the frozen landscape. On November 23, 1942, they met at the bridge at Kalach. In a moment that many veterans described as the turning point of the entire war, the Soviet tank commanders lit flares to signal their success. The trap was shut. The Sixth Army, which had been the hunter for 3 years, was now the prey. They were no longer the masters of the steppe, they were the inhabitants of the Kessel, the cauldron. This brings us to a terrifying realization for the 300,000 men inside that circle. They weren't just surrounded by enemies, they were surrounded by a winter for which they were never prepared. The subhumans they had dismissed months ago had just executed the most sophisticated encirclement in the history of modern warfare. There is a particular kind of dread that sets in when a man realizes the ground beneath him is no longer his own. For the 300,000 souls trapped within the Stalingrad pocket, that realization arrived with the biting wind of late November. They called it the Kessel, the cauldron. It's an evocative term, suggesting a slow, simmering heat, but for the Sixth Army, the reality was a deep, bone-shattering freeze. History suggests that an army, much like a living organism, cannot survive once its arteries are severed. The moment the Soviet pincers met at the Kalach Bridge, the Sixth Army ceased to be an offensive force and became a massive, stationary target. Therefore, the first instinct of any rational commander would be a breakout, a desperate, all-out punch to the west to reconnect with the main German lines. General Kallis had the men, and for a brief window he had the fuel, but the order from the Wolfslayer was absolute: Festung Stalingrad, Fortress Stalingrad. Hitler had decreed that the city would be held at all costs, promising that the Luftwaffe would supply the army from the air. This was the great lie of the cauldron. Hermann Göring, the head of the German Air Force, boasted that his planes could fly 500 tons of supplies every day. It was a mathematical impossibility that any man with a pencil and a ledger could have debunked. To sustain 300,000 men, you need a constant stream of high-calorie food, winter clothing, and, most importantly, fuel to keep the engines running and the heaters glowing. The Luftwaffe, hampered by the brutal Russian winter and a resurgent Soviet Air Force, rarely managed to deliver even 100 tons. Many of us have felt the sting of a broken promise, but for the soldiers in the Kessel, this betrayal was lethal. Instead of bread and bullets, the transport planes sometimes arrived carrying crates of pepper or thousands of right-foot-only boots, the tragic result of a panicked and collapsing logistics chain. As the temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees, the German soldier, once the best equipped in the world, began to look like a ghost. They wore Stalingrad boots, which were essentially bundles of straw and rags wrapped around their feet. They huddled in frozen foxholes, often sharing the space with the corpses of their comrades because the ground was too hard to dig graves. The daily ration was eventually reduced to a single slice of sawdust-filled bread and a bowl of watery horse tea, broth made from the carcasses of the thousands of horses that had pulled their supply wagons. When the horses were gone, there was nothing. Operation Winter Storm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant mind in the German army, launched a rescue mission from the south. His panzer divisions fought through blizzard conditions, eventually coming within 30 miles of the pocket. The men in the Kessel could see the flashes of German artillery on the horizon. They could hear the distant thunder of salvation. Therefore, this was the moment of truth. Manstein signaled Pallas to blow thunder, the code word to begin a breakout attempt to meet the rescue force. It was a 30-mile gap, a half-day's drive, but Pallas, ever-obedient staff officer, refused to move without a direct order from Hitler. And Hitler, still obsessed with the symbolic value of the city, refused to give it. The rescue force was eventually pushed back by a massive Soviet counterattack. As the flashes on the horizon faded and the sound of the German guns grew quiet, a heavy, suffocating despair settled over the cauldron. The men knew then that they had been abandoned. They were no longer a master race or a glorious army. They were a political sacrifice. By January 1943, the Soviet Union launched Operation Ring, the final squeeze to liquidate the pocket. They didn't just attack with tanks, they used psychological warfare. All through the night, powerful loudspeakers blared the ticking of a clock, followed by a voice in German. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia. Stalingrad is a mass grave. This brings us to the final agonizing collapse, the moment where the machinery of war simply ran out of oil and hope. By late January, the Soviets had overrun the last 2 vital airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak. This was the final blow. No airfields meant no more Ju-52 transport planes landing with even a handful of supplies. It meant no more sawdust bread to keep the stomach from eating itself, and more tragically, no more mail. For the soldier in the snow, a letter from home was the only thing keeping his mind sane. Now, even that ghost of a connection was severed. The Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force. It was a collection of starving men waiting for the end. The pocket was split in two, north and south, and the very concrete jungle they had bled for months to capture now became their frozen tomb. But Hitler, safe in his bunker, had one last move. In a final act of cynical manipulation, he promoted Friedrich Paulus to field marshal. It wasn't an honor, it was a death sentence. Hitler knew that in the entire history of the Prussian and German military, no field marshal had ever been taken alive. He expected Paulus to take his own life for the glory of the Reich. But Paulus, looking at the thousands of dying men around him, finally found a limit to his obedience. He chose to live. When he emerged from the basement of the ruined Univermag department store, a place that once sold civilian finery and now smelled only of death, the myth of German invincibility wasn't just cracked, it was ground into the frozen mud of the Volga by the boots of the Red Army. The subhumans had defeated the master race in the most decisive way possible. There's a specific hollow silence that follows the end of a long struggle, a quiet so profound it feels heavier than the noise that preceded it. On February 2nd, 1943, that silence fell over the ruins of Stalingrad. The guns that had roared for 5 months finally went cold, and for the first time in years, the master race found itself looking up from the bottom of a pit it had dug for itself. History suggests that the death of an army is rarely a clean affair. It is a slow, agonizing dissolution of everything a man thought he knew about the world. When the final remnants of the Sixth Army laid down their arms, the world witnessed a sight that would have been unthinkable just 12 months prior. Roughly 91,000 German soldiers, shattered, frostbitten, and skeletal, emerged from the cellars and sewer pipes. Among them were 22 generals and a field marshal. Therefore, the surrender wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a total systemic collapse. The myth of the subhuman Soviet was replaced by the reality of the Red Army soldier standing tall, draped in thick wool and fur, holding a submachine gun pointed at the heart of the Third Reich. But the surrender was not the end of the suffering, it was merely the beginning of a different kind of hell. You see, the German soldier had been told that to be captured by the Soviets was a fate worse than death. As they began the long march into captivity, many realized the propaganda was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. These men were already on the verge of death from starvation and typhus, but the Soviet Union, having seen its own cities razed and its people slaughtered by these very men, was in no mood for mercy. The reality of the march into Siberia is one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Of those 91,000 men who marched out of the ruins, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most of them succumbed to exhaustion and cold within the first few weeks of captivity. It's a statistic that hits you in the chest when you consider the families waiting back home, the wives and mothers who received nothing but a missing in action notice and a lifetime of silence. The Soviet Union, however, felt a new sense of destiny. Before Stalingrad, the Red Army was a desperate force fighting for survival. After Stalingrad, it was a juggernaut. They had proven to themselves and to the world that the German war machine could not only be stopped, but could be utterly annihilated. This brings us to the birth of a new world. The victory at Stalingrad fundamentally shifted the global balance of power. Up until this point, the Western Allies, the US and Great Britain, had been cautious, unsure if the Soviets could hold out. So the total destruction of the Sixth Army changed the diplomatic calculus. It gave Joseph Stalin a seat at the head of the table. He now held the blood equity of the war. For those of us who grew up during the Cold War, it's vital to remember that the borders of modern Europe were drawn in the frozen blood of the Volga. The Soviet push westward didn't stop until they reached the Reichstag in Berlin. The Iron Curtain that would descend across the continent had its first links forged in the concrete jungle we discussed earlier. The death of the Sixth Army also meant the death of the German public's absolute faith in Hitler. For the first time, the Nazi government had to declare a period of national mourning. The propaganda could no longer hide the scale of the disaster. Many Germans began to realize that the war was no longer about conquest. It was about the inevitable arrival of a vengeful enemy at their own gates. That was the realization that Stalingrad was the hinge of the 20th century. It was the moment the old European order died and the era of the two superpowers began. The Sixth Army had marched east to build a 1,000-year empire. Instead, they built a graveyard that served as the foundation for the world we lived in for the next 50 years. There is a haunting quality to landscape around the modern city of Volgograd. If you walk the fields where the cauldron once stood, the earth still occasionally gives up its secrets: a rusted helmet, a rotted boot, or the bone of a man who was once someone's son, thousands of miles from home. History suggests that while the names of cities change and the scars of the earth heal, the ghosts of our mistakes remain to speak to anyone willing to listen. For the men of the Sixth Army, the end didn't come with a flourish of trumpets or a grand final stand. It came with the whimper of a frozen man in a cellar who had run out of things to believe in. The master race myth had promised them the world, but it couldn't even provide them with a blanket. Therefore, the ghost of the Sixth Army isn't just a military memory, it is a permanent monument to the danger of believing your own propaganda. We live in a world that prizes disruption and boldness, much like the architects of the Third Reich did. But Stalingrad teaches us a much older, more grounded lesson, that reality has a way of asserting itself, no matter how much power you have to deny it. Hitler looked at the Soviet Union and saw what he wanted to see: a weak, fragmented people. He ignored the industrial data, he ignored the logistical limitations, and most importantly, he ignored the human spirit. Many of us in our later years have seen this play out in smaller ways. The businessman who ignores the market shift because he's always been right, or the leader who surrounds himself with yes-men until the truth is a foreign language. The purple value of this history is that it serves as the ultimate case study in hubris. It shows us that the moment you decide your opponent is subhuman or incapable, you have already handed them the keys to your destruction. But there is a second ghost that lingers over the Volga, the ghost of the unheeded warning. Think back to the generals who saw the Soviet tanks gathering on the flanks. Think of the logistics officers who warned that the horses were dying and the fuel was gone. They spoke the truth, but the truth was politically inconvenient. In a culture of fear and ideological purity, the truth is often the first casualty. Logistics, preparation, and the humility to respect one's adversary. The Sixth Army wasn't defeated by a lack of courage. Those men fought with a tenacity that horrified even their enemies. They were defeated by a leadership that had lost its grip on the physical world. As we look back through the lens of 80 years, we see that Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. It was the moment the 20th century decided it would not be a German century. Therefore, the world we inherited, the world of the Cold War, the space race, and the eventual rise of a globalized economy, was born in that frozen rubble. The final lesson, the one that resonates most with a mature audience who has seen the seasons of life change, is that strength without wisdom is merely a faster way to fall. The Sixth Army was perhaps the most powerful military force ever assembled up to that point in history. It had the best technology, the best training, and the most experienced officers. But it was led by a man who mistook his own desires for destiny. Today, the wind still blows across the Russian steppe, and the Volga still flows, indifferent to the ideologies of men. The 300,000 Germans and the over 1 million Soviets who perished there are now part of the soil. They remind us that the cost of hubris is always paid by the many for the delusions of the few. It is a story that doesn't just belong in a textbook, it belongs in our conscience, a steady reminder to always check the map, listen to the warnings, and never, ever assume the other side is less human than ourselves. History is more than just a collection of dates and dead men. It's a mirror held up to our own time. If you've stuck with us through the ruins of Stalingrad, it's because you understand that the lessons of hubris and resilience are as vital today as they were in 1943. If this deep dive added value to your day, consider subscribing to join our community of history enthusiasts. We don't chase the headlines here, we chase the truth. And before you go, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the Sixth Army's fate was sealed by Hitler's ego, or was the Soviet resurgence simply an unstoppable force of nature? Your perspective helps keep this history alive. Thank you for watching.